I think we have a real treat. For decades at the Washington Post and the New York Times, Peter Baker has taken us behind the scenes to distill and analyze some of the most consequential events of our time. He's introduced us to characters big and small who have figured prominently in our politics and policy. And I don't know how he does it, but inexplicably, he makes it all look so damn easy. And I'm sure it's not, especially the piece I hope you had a chance to look at from yesterday, the spry diplomat with a stiff gait. I thought it was a great example of threading the needle on a very, very difficult issue and presenting a fair depiction of our 80-year-old president. His writing is accessible as it is authoritative, a product of deep sourcing and study across Democratic and Republican administrations. So with that, please welcome Peter Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm so happy to be here with you guys today. I'm so happy to be speaking to you after you have cupcakes. I know that's going to be a good thing for me. And hopefully that means you will be in a great mood. I'm looking around and trying to figure out which of you guys is going to be my boss in about 5 years, but I bet you one of you will. It is a great thing to have the new generation of journalists here, and I think you guys are coming along at a really amazing time to be in the field. It is the good news and the bad news is basically the same thing. Journalism is changing, right? And the bad news is that means that it's a little in flux, so we don't know where the jobs are going to be, we don't know where the organizations are going to be, some are closing, some are cutting. But there's also a lot of creative innovation going on right now. And it's so fascinating for me as an old timer to see how things are evolving. And that includes in my paper as much of a musty old gray lady as we may be, the times is changing along with our moment. And I think that to see the entrepreneurship that we are experiencing across the business is only going to be even more exciting as you guys, take on leadership roles in the next few years. I'm not much of a speechifier. I don't have a stock speech. I'll talk for a couple minutes, but really I'd just like to open up and we can have a conversation. You guys have any questions I can help with? Tell me what we're doing wrong, what we could do better. That's fine too. I was asked to talk a little bit about how journalism has changed in my time. I've been doing it 37 years now. So it's changed a lot. When I started, we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have email. If you wanted to see a document by the government, you had to go physically to the courthouse or the county board headquarters, the city council or whatever to get it. When we got fax machines, that was a huge innovation. Really very cool. When I started at the White House, which was in 1996, we had beepers that we wore on our belts. And if the White House was going to put out a statement, you would get beeped and you would have to physically go to the White House if you weren't there and go to the wooden bins and pull out the pieces of paper where they had put whatever announcement they are going to have put out there. The difference, though, is that at that time when I was starting out, we wrote one story a day. And it didn't really matter, frankly, if I knew the news at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, because I wasn't going to write it until 6 o'clock anyway. And it was only going to appear once. It was going to appear in the next day's print paper, and that would be the end of it. Today, the job is infinitely different. And you guys experience this, I'm positive. And you guys, in fact, don't even consider it unusual, probably. But you are, at my job anyway, you are a newspaper reporter, but you are a magazine writer. You are a wire reporter. You are a radio reporter. You are a broadcaster. You are a social media transmitter, whatever the word would be. You do so many things in the course of a day. And that's one of the essential challenges, I think, of our time as we evolve our journalism, as we take advantage of these new technologies and new ways of telling stories. How do we make sure we are true to our fundamental values, which have not changed and should not change just because technology changes, right? And what are those values? Those values are fairness, open-mindedness, intense research, searching for truth, searching for facts, not taking sides, but making sure people get information that people in power may not want them to have. All of those things haven't changed since I was young. Those are still the truth today, whether we do it through Twitter and Instagram or, clever graphic presentations of stories, or we do it through the old-fashioned 1,000 words, inverted pyramid style. And so I guess what I would just say to you as we start off this conversation is to always keep in mind those fundamental values. The fundamental values have not changed, should not change, just because our times have changed. And we've seen a real stress test, I think, these last 4 or 5 years, especially with Trump, right? Because he challenged a lot of the things that we consider to be journalistic nostrums. And there was this feeling like, well, maybe the old ways don't work anymore. We shouldn't just do on the one hand, on the other hand. Both-siderism is bad. Whataboutism is bad. All which is true. My view is that's not what the old values were. The old values were never about giving equal weight to unequal arguments. Our values have always been about finding the facts and presenting them to readers in a fair and impartial way, but if the facts are demonstrably weighted in one way, then they should come across that way in our stories and our other ways we tell our journalism. So I think that we've seen this real interesting debate the last few years about the nature of journalism in the Trump era. And my view is this is exactly the moment when we need to stick to fundamentals. It's exactly the minute that objectivity may not be the right word, but neutrality and fairness and fact-driven reporting matters more than ever, because we've got a lot of voices out there right now telling you what to think. What we need are people to tell you what's going on so you can figure out how to think, right? Our audiences can figure out how to think, not that we can tell them that. So that's the last thing I would say about the media today is that we have, of course, used this word media as if it was somehow a monolith. The media, of course, is not a single entity. All of you guys come from different organizations, each of which have different styles and ways you approach the news. And within your organization, presumably, there are different jobs and roles, right? There is the opinion writer, there is the columnist, there is the news writer, there is the graphics style journalist and podcaster, and unfortunately, one of the things we have not done a good job, I think, in the media is making clear these lines that we have and that we respect to our viewers and our readers, so they understand what's the difference, right? That in fact, when they see a news reporter, a beat reporter, that's not somebody who's the same as a columnist or an editorial writer, but they don't see the difference and they think, oh, all the same. Instead, lump us all in. The media's to this, the media's to that. Well, what do you mean by that? Who are you talking about when you say that? Are you talking about the people you see on the cable shows who are going at it like that, left and right, and are meant to do that, which is fine? Or are we talking about reporters who are actually trying to unearth information and provide you with the news of the day? Because those are not the same thing. And we've blurred that line too much. I'm part of that. I appear on television. It used to be when I would go on, I would refuse to go on a panel that had a Democrat or a Republican or an opinion columnist because I didn't want to be confused. For somebody like that, my job is to be a beat reporter. And ultimately I gave up because it's just not the way these television programs work these days. So I try to stick within my lane, whatever I say, regardless who else may be on the panel with me. But it's not surprising that our viewers and our readers are confused about who we are at times. So we need to do a better job, I think, of communicating to them what our values are and how they matter and why we pursue them, why we think they're important. I would commend to you two pieces written recently that I think do a fabulous job of explaining that. One by Marty Barron, the former executive editor of the Washington Post. I see a Post person here. I don't know if you knew Marty. Marty is fabulous. He explains, I think, in very powerful terms what we do as journalists and why it's important. And he says to them, to the critics of ours who say, well, objectivity is just a way of, enabling Trump the fascist or whatever. No, objectivity is something we should want, even if it's not achievable, in our reporters, just like we want it in our scientists and in our judges and in our doctors. We don't want doctors who have already decided what the answer is. We want doctors who are looking for the facts and then tell you what those facts add up to. That should be the same as journalists. And so when our readers and our critics say, well, gosh, objectivity is an old and musty tradition that we should throw out. Remember that journalism is, in fact, a service like medicine and judges and others who we want to be fair-minded, open-minded, fact-based, not opinion-based, at least from the perspective of the beat reporters. The second piece I would recommend was written by my publisher, A.G. Solzberger, who takes on the same issue, basically, of whether our journalism today. and I can find those links and send them to you. They're really, really two such seminally important pieces, because I think these last 5 years has been a real identity crisis in some ways for journalism. But this is the first time we've had the president of our country call us as a group enemies of the people, and to try to cast us as the opposition. Remember, he wants us to be the opposition. We should not buy into that, because then we are actually playing into his hands. We are not opposition. We are independent. And there's a difference, right? Independent, not oppositional. That doesn't mean that the incumbents will ever be happy with independence. They're not. But that's the whole point, is that we're not to be there as part of their bullhorn, their propaganda loudspeaker, and we're not there to be part of their enemies' loudspeaker either. We're there to try to find facts and find the truth that our readers and viewers can't get anywhere else. So I guess with that, I would just go ahead and open it up for questions, if that's all right. Sure. I don't know if anything I said is interesting or you have other questions, so there's no rules. Just ask anything you want.
I have one here.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Brian Metzger with Insider. You're kind of, I don't think you're necessarily the first White House reporter to talk to us, but a lot of the people who have talked to us are kind of more congressional reporters. Mm-hmm. And so I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit about how you make the White House just as a beat work for you, because I think we as a group have heard a lot about how Congress is the best beat in town because, there's a million principles and it's freewheeling, and the White House is a lot more constrained. So I'm curious to hear you just talk a little bit more about kind of the mechanics of how you do your job and how you differentiate yourself from all the other people in the briefing room and covering the White House.
Well, that's a good question. Thank you. You're right. Look, being a congressional reporter has its definite advantages, and I've not been one, but I've spent time up there, so I understand the difference. The difference is, of course, you have 535 sources plus their staffs all there, waiting to be plucked, right? How fun is that when you don't have to actually fight to find somebody who you can talk to and who will talk to you? That's totally different in the White House. In the White House, we do not have room to roam the grounds. We're not allowed to walk up and down the halls and knock on doors and catch people from running from one event to the other saying, "What do you think?" We are constrained to a very small piece of the building, and very few of them will talk to us. Certainly on record, and even on background, it's hard to get them to talk. So it's a very different challenge, right? What I think is great about the White House, as opposed to Congress, sorry, Congress reporters, is that what happens to the White House is history. You have one focus, and that is the President of the United States, right? You have one focus, not 535, and therefore you're a character portraiture, a portraitress in a way, right? You're drawing a portrait every day of this one character. And the people around him, and eventually her. I mean, there are obviously other interesting people like Vice President Harris and the Chief of Staff and the National Security Advisor. But broadly speaking, it is all derivative of the person at the center, who is the president. And so as a reporter, while you don't have the same access and kind of freedom that you get on the Hill, you have the beauty of having a single person that you're trying to really focus on and understand. And there are plenty of sources. They're just often not in that building. When I started in the beat, a woman who was legendary at the time named Ann Devroy did it before I did. I wish you guys had ever met Ann Devroy. She was just the best White House reporter I have ever known in my entire life. She had them quaking in her. They feared her, Republican and Democrat alike, and because they feared her, they told her everything. It's a great act. It doesn't work for everybody, but boy, they just were afraid of her. Did you know Ann? She was amazing.
A force.
She was a force, and she just, they just were so afraid of her. She knew the building better than they did. How did she know the building better than they did? Partly because she'd been there for longer. Partly, though, because she understood, and she told me this, that the real sources aren't necessarily in the building. Who are they? Well, the Hill are good sources for covering the White House. All right? The lobbyists, the K Street people, good sources for covering the White House. The agencies and departments, the cabinet departments especially, good sources for covering the White House. All of them have an incentive in telling you things that the White House itself might not want you to know, partly because they're in competition with them, right? Or they're trying to influence them, or they're trying to fight a decision that they lost, or something like that. But try to figure out in any institution, and it's true of the White House, who are they talking to? And those are your sources.
So my name is Christina. I'm with CBS News. And I was just wondering, how is your process of every time there's a change in administration and changing? Is it kind of like a change in beats? Because obviously there's a new person coming in with new cabinet, with new members. And also, like, can you tell us a little bit about how that difference before Trump was in office and after Trump took over? How was that process?
It's a good question. Each administration is different, right? Each White House is different, and it flows from the top. It depends on the person who's president and what kind of environment they create, what kind of attitude they have. Different White Houses have different levels of access. Some of them are more responsive than others. Some of them are more dishonest than others. And it's not, I haven't found I wouldn't say that there's a clear pattern, because each one can be different regardless of party or individual. I would say that the one through line from starting in 1996, 27 years ago to today, is that it has gotten more and more closed over time, that briefings become less and less useful, that on the record becomes more and more of a thing of the past. It used to be that we did things on the record, then they started trying to do more things on background, then they started trying to do things more on deep background, and now you have people saying, let's do things off the record, and then you can to back, right? Screw that. I mean, like, no way. The idea that I'm going to go from off the record to background, what a great gift you've given me so I can use you anonymously, no chance. And so, each White House, you try to adjust to their rhythm, right, and see how they operate. And Trump is the one exception, of course, to everything. There were no rules in the Trump White House. There were just none. I mean, it was free for all. It was a complete carnival. We had lots of sources because they were all busy fighting each other and using us to try to fight each other. And so they would tell us things that no other White House would tell you. And he would tell you things that no other president would ever tell you. I mean, of all the things we say about Trump, and there's a lot to say about him, he was remarkably transparent in his in the way he governed. He told us what he was thinking 24 hours a day, more than we wanted to know. And I mean, he was practically to the point where if he went to the bathroom, he would tell us. I mean, we knew what, the only time I've ever experienced in 27 years of covering the White House, the only time we had a president who we genuinely knew what he was thinking almost all the time, and what his motivations were for doing the things he was going to do. Most presidents at least try to couch what they're doing in some sort of more noble, tones. Trump didn't bother to do that. If he was going to use the Justice Department to go after his enemy, he would just say it, right? If he was going to corrupt the armed forces to use them as a tool for suppression of people he didn't like, he would just say it. He didn't try to hide his motives. So now that was obviously maybe not good for the country, good for journalists though, because we didn't have to even pretend that his motives were anything other than what they were. But he is a one-off, so we don't, don't assume any other White House will ever be like his. They're much more like Biden. Biden's White House is something like the Obama White House in that, of course, it's a lot of the same people, right? So when they came in, I knew, any of us who covered the Obama people knew half the people just to start with, which helps. You have relationships, you have, an understanding of who they are and how they work and everything. I would say the Obama people yelled more. I would say the Biden people try to edit more. And by that I mean that when the Obama people were mad at you, they would just let you know, and they would call you all kinds of names and be complete dicks. And the Biden people trying to get you to change your story after you've already put it online. Okay, I see your story, it's there, but if you said this in this paragraph and this in this paragraph, like, you're not my editor. You don't get to do that. But they think that they can, and they will press their advantage as long as you let them do it. And so it's a real balance there to manage that. They don't yell as much, but they're more intrusive in that sense and kind of annoying.
Hi, Kirsten Garris, Cox Media Group. So I've had a chance to cover the White House a little bit, and I've been in the briefing room, and I was petrified, but I got one question in. But to that point,
Did you get an answer, though?
I did.
Okay.
Yes, and it worked in a story. But my seat's in the 6th row, so I'm in the back. But I'll say for you, you're in a bigger paper, so you're closer to the front. On big days when there's a lot of, everyone's going to ask about the same topic, how do you kind of go about crafting your questions so that yours is different, knowing 10 reporters are all going to ask about debt ceiling or, unclassified documents? I mean, what's your process to try to make sure you get that extra nugget? And then how do you kind of approach those topics where, again, you're sitting with 40 other people covering your beat versus Congress where we have 500 plus stories. You have, everyone's in the same room. So kind of how do you address those kind of aspects?
No, that's a really good question. You're right. I'm not in the 6th row. I'm in the 2nd row. But that does mean, therefore, as you say, all the obvious questions will have been asked by the time they move to the 2nd row, probably. So if I'm interested in asking a question, it would generally be the second order question, like, okay, I know that we asked X, so what would be therefore the follow-up to that they might not have gotten from the front row? And I try to listen, actually. I think that's something we don't do enough during briefings because we come in with our pre-written questions and we don't listen to what the press secretary or the president or whoever the principal is has just said. And so listen to what they're saying, because sometimes what they're saying requires you to follow up. A, they might not have answered the question, right? So push them. Sir, you didn't answer Jennifer's question right there. Can we try it again? She asked you this, blah, blah, blah. Or, ma'am, you just said this. What does that actually mean in terms of real people? Or does that mean this? Or should we interpret what you just said to mean Y? Because what we often don't do enough in the briefing room is play off of each other. Which is too much, a lot of lone actors, rather than an orchestrated, and it shouldn't be too orchestrated, but a more symbiotic kind of organism, if you will, that tries to like pin down whoever the briefer is to really understand what they're saying, instead of just simply, okay, you ask yours, I'm going to ask mine, he'll ask hers. You know what I mean? Like we don't follow each other up enough, and we ought to do it just to back each other up, because a lot of people get away with not answering a question, and nobody will call them on it.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm with CQ Roll Call. I wanted to go back to what you said about the Biden folks trying to edit more. I was wondering if you give us some...
See, she's listening. She's asking a question based on something I said. Exactly right.
I was wondering if you could give us some examples maybe of attempts that were successful, that like they convinced the New York Times, like, yes, this is worth changing post-publishing, and ones where you just laughed them out of the room.
It's a good question. It used to be easier because we used to have a pretty solid rule that once something showed up in print, we just didn't change it, absent a factual error. If we had a factual error, we would of course change it and issue a correction. A lot of these don't fall into that clear-cut black and white, situation. It's much more gray. And the question is, okay, they're making a point. Are they making a point that's a fair point that would make the story fairer, better, fuller, more fully informative if we were to go along with it? Or are they just spinning and we should ignore them? And that's a hard challenge. So an example, you asked for an example. Let's talk about the story yesterday, the story about Biden's age. They came back and asked two things after it published. One was I had a part in there where I said that they schedule him so that he is mostly public in the afternoon, not in the evenings, and that they take what they consider to be reasonable accommodations to not overtax him for his age. I know this to be true. I've heard this from very, very senior people, but they wanted to pretend that's not true. And they offered up an on-the-record quote from somebody who's important and high up saying, no, we don't do that. The second thing they asked, and I'll come back to what we did. The second thing they asked was, we said in there that they shield him from media scrutiny in the sense that he's not given he's given 1/4 as many interviews to reporters as Trump did, 1/5 as many or 1/4 as many, I've forgotten, as Obama, and not a single one to a newspaper, to a major newspaper. Not one. Not one to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Politico, anybody else who is they've done TV, but they've never done a single one with a major newspaper. That's a first. I try to look back at just the New York Times. I mean, as far as I can tell, the New York Times talked to every president since Grover Cleveland. I said in the story, since Franklin Roosevelt, because some of the ones before him I think weren't necessarily on the record or whatever, and I tried to be apples and apples. So I said in the story, every president since Franklin Roosevelt, with the exception of Eisenhower, had given an on-the-record interview to news reporters from the New York Times. A columnist, but that's a different thing. And Biden is the only one who hasn't. And they try to come back on that and say, well, we have this whole media strategy. It's really about reaching people where they are. And this is all about the media strategy. It's not about protecting him because he's old. And I'm like, so what you asked me what I did. On the first one, because they were offering an on-the-record quote, I felt in the interest of fairness, I would put an on-the-record quote allowing them to deny something, although frankly, I think it's bullshit. On the second one, I said, no way. I don't buy it. It's complete. I mean, it's not just bullshit. It's incredible bullshit. And secondly, we did a whole story recently about his failure to talk to the newspapers and do serious media. And we allowed them in that story to give their explanation. And we linked to it in this story. And I didn't feel the need to repeat that, especially because I didn't think it was true. And the other thing is like, okay, maybe that is true. It still doesn't say why you don't give it an interview to a newspaper. It doesn't actually explain it. If you want to give more interviews to Drew Barrymore, I get it. Okay, if you want to have Jason Bateman be your major interlocutor, sure, I understand that. That still doesn't mean, and if you don't like that we say you don't give interviews to newspapers, there's an easy way to solve that. Give an interview to a newspaper. And as A.G. Silverberg, our publisher, told the vice president just last week, she says, it doesn't have to be us. You don't like us, you think we're terrible, unfair, fine. Give it to the Washington Post, give it to the Wall Street Journal, give it to somebody. You're not going to convince me that they're not trying to protect him if you don't give those interviews. So I thought that was BS. I didn't go along with that one.
Hey, I'm Andrea Castillo. I'm with the LA Times. I cover immigration, and one of the things you mentioned earlier was just how what used to be on the record is now more and more often on background or off the record. I have found it, I've been covering immigration since Obama, and I have found it increasingly difficult to get on the record attributed statements from these agencies. And I feel like it's so hard to push back on that as an individual, because they can say, oh, well, if I give you an on the record statement, or if I allow you to attribute this to somebody, then other outlets are going to ask me for the same thing. So how do you push back on that?
How horrible, right? How horrible.
Yeah.
I might speak to other reporters.
Right. So how do you push back on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not easy, and they don't make it easy, and it's intentional. It's hard. A couple of things I would say. One is we've now established a policy, had for several years. We don't use background quotes. We will not use anything in quote marks without a name attached, period. Now, you're going to find some examples in the paper that are not following that policy, but that is the policy. And every policy is violated somewhere or another, but that is the policy now, and I don't use it. And I'm glad about that. I'm so glad about that, because we should not especially be giving the bullshit propaganda talking points quotes without a name attached. Why should we do that? That's nonsense. If you're going to be a taxpayer paid, especially the spokespeople, which really bothers me, paid by the taxpayers to speak to the public, why wouldn't your name be attached? Where is the reason for secrecy there? So I think we should be pushing back harder. We should probably be doing it more collectively. I think you could say to them, look, not every story is going to work this way. It depends on the thing. If it's something where they have an interest in getting into your story, you should just use that, because you have more power than you think you do. I remember one story with the Obama people, and they said, no, we won't. They said, here's a background. I said, I'm not asking for a background quote. I am doing this story. I want to know on the record, what is the White House's response? You don't want to give it to me on the record, fine. I will say you declined to comment, but I'm not taking it on background, period. And they said, okay, well, we're not giving it to you. I said, fine. I published the story, and that night they called me after it was published, and then suddenly they said, okay, we can be on the record, because they realized they looked terrible without their response in there. So we have more power at times in that kind of circumstance than we think we do, because they should not be allowed to give their spin without their names attached. Now, when they're giving you stuff that's really useful to you, that's not spin, it's harder, and you have to sort of work with them. We have a rule against something called quote approval. We all do it probably anyway. I'm generally really against the quote approval thing. For those of you who might not have tried, what that means is, especially the White House will say, we'll speak to you on background, and then you come back to us with the quotes, and we'll decide whether we want to put them on the record. That's very pernicious. That's a terrible policy. And I've done it. We've all done it probably because we're so desperate to get something on the record. And it started, I'll tell you how this started. I think this started in the 90s, because I remember in the 90s, my editor said to me, why are these quotes on background? These are really basic quotes. Why would they not want their names attached? Go back to them and see if they'll put them on the record. And I would go back, and I would and half time they go, yeah, that's okay. I'm okay with that quote. That's fine to be on the record. They would talk on background because they're scared. But if they knew what they were going to be quoted saying, they're comfortable with it. All right. I thought that was kind of a revelation to me. Okay, good. Then we can get more stuff on the record. That's a good thing for our readers to be on the record. The White House turned it into a bad thing, because that's what they do. Right? And this is Republican, Democrats, not partisan. They began to realize they could control us through this idea of quote approval. And it became a policy rather than an exception. And they use it as a way of controlling how they get their message across through us. And that's something we shouldn't allow them to do as best we can. This is a very long-winded answer. The last trick I try to do it in the same phone call. Fine, we'll talk on background, because I understand you're uncomfortable. You don't want to just be, you want to be loose and not worry that something you say will be, overly flip and your name attached. Fine. But at the end of the conversation, we're going to take 5 minutes. We're going to be on the record. And I'm going to come back to you on some of the questions I asked, and you're going to know you're on the record and say what it is you feel comfortable saying on the record. Now, this only works for people who are willing to be on the record on some level or another, right? But this is a better alternative than later coming back to them with specific quotes and asking for approval, because we shouldn't be in the position of being supplicants, for one thing. And second of all, it just allows them to start arguing and editing and stuff like that, which we should just not let them do. So that try the 5-minute thing at the end of the conversation. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. And people who are comfortable say, okay, I can do that. And I say, look, you talked about this during our background part. What would you say on the record to this point? And then they know what they're saying that is on the record. Therefore, they're comfortable with how they put it. You know, they're not going to say something that they think is going to get them in trouble. I don't know if that's helpful.
My name is James. I'm with Fox News. I know that you've written a lot about just beyond the White House, also about national security. I cover a little bit of that as well. I was just wondering, in terms of that relationship, how you manage between the White House and the Pentagon, especially while they kind of work together. They're almost sort of adversaries in certain ways.
Thank God for that.
In terms of developing
For us.
Yeah, in terms of developing relationships, getting
Yeah.
people to trust you, especially when they're not sure. And as we know, the Pentagon can be even less transparent than the White House. So I was just wondering how you sort of dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is just at this point, experience in long relationships, right? So when the Biden people came in and they put various people at the Defense Department, I knew this one, this one, this one, and this one from various iterations of their careers and mine. So that helps. You try to get the people that you've built relationships with. You try to see, you know, again, like Ann Deveroy told me, try to get to know people without a story being attached to people outside the White House. Through coffees and dinners and stuff like that. We invite people over for dinner all the time who are officials, and just to get to know them if we don't know them, or to, you know, loosen them up, not with specific stories in mind, but just to kind of create that relationship so that when the moment comes, you can call them and ask questions. I go to a lot of conferences where people will show up and you get to know them that way. Foreign policy conferences, national security conferences. There's a row of places on Massachusetts Avenue, does them all the time. You'll be surprised how many people show up there that would be good sources for you. Like the program itself might not be all that newsworthy as far as you're concerned, but as a source building exercise. And then you become, in some ways, part of that circle a little bit. They start to know you and feel comfortable with you, and you can build that way. But it's not easy. It's hard. But the good thing is that the Pentagon and the White House do not always see eye to eye, and they will rat each other out sometimes.
Play them off each other.
Always, sure, of course. Well, they say you're an idiot. What do you think?
Hi, I'm Naomi Lim. I'm with the Washington Examiner. I also cover the White House from the back of the briefing room. One of the people I love watching, though, is Mike Shear. I feel like he does a really good job of needling but still being charming at the same time.
Yes, that's right. That's the way we needling but charming.
I have two questions. So, like the idea that you kind of said about, so I think particularly with this White House, leaks are pretty strategic, and sometimes, you know, you are being used. Have you been in a situation where you've kind of bristled at the idea of, like, they've, you know, given you a story and you feel like it's like just that idea of being used?
Yeah.
And then the second question I have is, like, you've also written quite a few books. Like, do you enjoy doing that more? What's your process with books like?
Yeah. Yes, leaks, obviously. Leaks can be unbidden, or, of course, somebody trying to use you. Absolutely. That's okay, as long as you're aware of it and you adjust for it. In other words, you don't obviously just take the press release. You figure out what their angle is, make sure that you have cross-checked things. You make sure that when you present it in the story that you have included whatever doubt or skepticism or contrary information that you can, understanding that they would prefer to use you to get this information out. It kind of depends on the story. It's hard to be specific, but it's okay as long as you know it. Where we need to resist the temptation is just because we have it exclusively doesn't necessarily make it really news. They do a lot with personnel, and I'm like, it's really just not our thing. I don't think most readers give a crap who the domestic policy council chief is. The honest truth is, I mean, we're going to write about it, yes, at some point. If Susan Rice steps down, she's fairly well known. But most of the personnel changes that they try to leak out really aren't that important to us. Which I've actually stopped doing that. Really, they don't leak it to us anymore because they recognize they're smart that they're going to get a better audience at Playbook or Axios or someplace like that. That actually is meant for that audience. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. I mean, it's just play your meteorization for the audience that you're trying to reach. And personnel, that's what Playbook is. It's partly a personnel, a bulletin board. So if I'm them, I'm going to leak it to them rather than any other time. But just be careful because, you don't know what you don't know. And when they're leaking you stuff and they try to control what you do with the leak, in other words, they won't let you call other people before whatever time they may have agreed to give you this information. I'll give you an example. This White House, and I don't know, maybe they don't do it with the Examiner, but they will send out in the evening before whatever event the president's going to have the next day, some sort of embargoed fact sheet on some micro, incredibly annoying small policy that couldn't possibly be interesting, and embargo it for 5 a.m. And they're trying to bait us into writing something that really, sometimes news, which is important, and you don't write it off, but sometimes it's just BS, right? Or just them trying to take advantage. So use your critical thinking, and we are now on their shit list on that. They no longer send us those because of one of your fellows from last year, Mark Walker, who works with me. I hope I'm not blowing anything. Mark had the temerity to quote a White House spokesman on the record by name. And the White House, ever since, has been punishing us by refusing to give us these little droplets that they give at night beforehand. Mark, who's not a White House reporter, but was doing something about some transportation policy, didn't understand that a paid spokesman for the government would not want to be quoted by name. And so he completely innocently quoted the person by name because it was an official press release put out by the government advancing a policy. There was nothing secret about it. There was nothing clandestine about it. And they were so mad that he quoted that person by name. They have cut us off from this list of things that they put out at night. And we're like, look, we're sorry. He didn't mean to do anything versus your rule. He just didn't understand your rule because your rule makes no sense. And he didn't mean to do anything to violate it, and they still decided to cut us off. And my bureau chief said, fine, fuck you. You want us to write about this stuff more than we want to write about it. And the truth is, I think we've missed nothing as a result. There's not been a single story that's been generated from one of these 5 a.m. things that I thought, gosh, I wish we had that first. Like a $2 million grant for whatever, it's just not a big news story. So I do, and then you asked the second question here, I've been blabbing on for so long. Books, real quickly on books. I love doing books. Books are great. You do a chance to go deeper, to get past the bullshit and try to understand a little more thoroughly what really happens. I've found in every book I've done how little I knew about the subject I thought I was covering until I did the book. I would say we reporters get maybe 20% of what's really going on in a White House, maybe more in Congress, but not more than that. And the Pentagon, I don't even know. Like we only get the surface of it, we get pieces of it. We're trying to make sense of the pieces like a hieroglyphic, or a criminology. And when you do a book, you have a chance to go back and get people to really own up after the events are over, or get documents or what have you, and start to realize how much was going on beneath the surface that we didn't get at the time. So it's a really valuable thing. When you get to the stage that you write a book, you will find, and you will, I think, you will find that you learn so much more about Washington that way.
From the fourth row of the briefing room here.
I'm very democratic on the briefing room.
Arthur Jones with ABC News. So I started out during Trump's administration, and that's the most recent one that we have, and you've covered many. And so similar to Christina's question, you've already covered him once. How are you preparing for a potential, Trump versus Biden 2024 or a Trump 2024? Can't believe I just said that, but we're almost there, perhaps.
Yeah, you're okay. You've been talking to my wife. She keeps asking me this too. She's, what if he wins? Are you going to stay doing this? I'm like, look, for journalism, this is an amazing thing. It's an incredible story. It's big. It's important. You couldn't imagine too many stories that are bigger in a political sense. Obviously, there's a stress level for reporters that come with covering Trump. Let's be honest. He's a very what's the right word? It's probably not a good word for it, but it's a very stressful thing to cover Trump, right? It's exhausting, just physically. I mean, when I was covering Trump, I could write 2 stories by 8:30 in the morning, not even be out of my pajamas, because he just keeps, he'll tweet out some crazy, incendiary thing, and you have to write it. We did less and less of that as it went along because it took the bar became higher for, how crazy it had to be before we could write it. But I think we should take it seriously, and I think that I think a lot of reporters, a lot of journalists didn't take Trump seriously after January 6th. They thought he was done. Not done. We got to take him seriously. So, for instance, when he had that tweet several months ago, and he said that he was calling for the termination of the Constitution. You may remember this. He called for the termination, he says, of all rules and laws, including those in the Constitution, that would prevent him from returning to office right away because Biden didn't really win. Termination of the Constitution. Wow. Right? Never in history have we had, presidents may have violated the Constitution. They may have pushed the boundaries of the Constitution. They didn't say outright, I'm terminating the Constitution. There's never something ever right, certainly didn't run for office on that platform. And he was calling for the termination of the Constitution. And we didn't write a story that day, which is a mistake. We should have. We came back the next day and did it. Even then, I think we should have made the lead of the paper. Because yes, we ought not to bow into every, wild thing he says because he's trying to get attention and he loves attention, and we shouldn't be a part of that necessarily. But when a person who was president of the United States, who wants to be president of the United States again, and is a leading candidate for his party's nomination, says he wants to terminate the Constitution, we ought to take it seriously. Similarly, he said the word retribution. These are two words we should remember about the Trump campaign. Termination, retribution. What is his campaign going to be about? He told us. He said it was going to be about retribution. Not, I'm going to make the country better. Not, I'm going to make your lives better. Retribution. We got to pay attention to that too. So yeah, you're right. It's the idea of a Trump-Biden campaign. Can both parties finally find somebody new, please? No. Okay, we're going to do the same guys again. Fine. But we should take it seriously because it is serious. And a lot is at stake. And I think that one thing about doing a book about Trump from his first term is we learn how many things he wanted to do, try to do, would have done, but didn't do because he had people around him who said, no, you can't do it. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. It's unwise. And they're not going to be around next time. And impeachment will not be a check. It's been impeached twice. What do you do? Impeach him a third time? No. And he can't run again unless he manages to tell us the 22nd Amendment's gone too. Right? So another election is not a constraint on him as well. So we as journalists ought to be aware of that and make sure we're clear about that in our coverage as well. That doesn't mean we're easy on Biden, by the way. I know some people say, well, Trump is such a singular threat, we should be nice to Biden as reporters. No, that's not our job. It's not our job to be nice to Biden. It's our job to be tough on everybody who wants to be president. That doesn't mean we're equally tough. We are responsive to what the news is. We are responsive to who they are. So we write about them in a full, honest way about their strengths and weaknesses. And if one of them is stronger than the other or weaker than the other, that'll come across through facts, not through our opining about it. I'm not sure I really answered your question. How my job changing, and will I still be in the job if you do? That's your interpretation. My wife says we can't do it again, and we can't do it. My wife's a journalist also; she writes for the New Yorker. She'll have to change, write about something else. And I'm the other way. I feel like I'm there until that story is done. Like I need to see the end of that story and how it finishes before I give up. You know what I mean? And I think it's important. I think it's important that we have reporters who report on, especially somebody like Trump, who is willing to do things other presidents aren't. And, it's not our job, again, to be his opposition, but it is our job to be the watchdog. And we should make sure that we are there to figure out what's happening, why it's happening, how it's happening, what would happen as a result of it happening, no matter how stressful it is, and no matter how, he can be very hostile. I remember shouting on me on Air Force One, telling me I had no right to cover him and stuff like that. I mean, it could be very hostile in a way that other presidents haven't been. Other presidents hate the press too, by the way. All presidents hate the press, just to be clear. And they will yell at you at times. It happens. Trump is different, though. I mean, he was questioning the very foundation of what we do. He questions the idea of a free press. It's not, I think the New York Times sucks. Get it. A lot of people do. It's the press is the enemy of the people, right? That is fundamentally different than Obama, who really didn't like us and stopped talking to me for 6 years. It's true. He shut me out the last 6 years of his presidency. I don't know why. He never said. But it's fundamentally different to have somebody out there questioning the idea of a free press. He said he attacks the press, he told Leslie Stahl, in order to discredit us, so that when we write something he doesn't like, people won't believe him. And he has literally said the words, don't trust anybody other than me. The other person I've covered who said those same words, by the way, is Vladimir Putin. That's a remarkably telling statement to say, don't trust anybody other than me, to discredit the idea of a free press. Again, you may not like the New York Times, fine, but the idea of a free press is a stake in that sense. And I think that we, again, we can't let ourselves be goaded into being the opposition, but we need to be clear-eyed about what that means.
I'm Eleanor Mueller. I cover congressional economics for Politico, and
You've had a busy few weeks.
yeah, I've written a few White House adjacent stories where the Biden White House specifically has come back and taken umbrage with something so seemingly minor. It just seems engineered to draw a correction.
Yes.
And I think I am early enough on in my career that I can kind of turn around and be like, I see what you're saying, but my editor says X, and if you have a problem with it, you can take it up with them.
Yes.
I'd assume you're at a point in your career where that response doesn't always fly. So how do you respond to those requests that maybe are not substantial in a way that it doesn't, maybe endanger your relationship?
Well, it's a good question, and you're right. They're very aggressive sometimes on that. I tell them, look, you don't want to talk to my editor. She is much tougher than I am. You talk to my editor, she will yell. She really, my bureau chief is amazing, Elizabeth Buehmiller. She does not put up with people trying to bulldog us into changing stories. She will, in fact, too much so. We sometimes try to but you just you do what you just said. You'd say, look, it's my editor. If you want to talk to the editor, you just be very professional with them. Say, I understand what you're saying. Our story's already run. Our policy is not to update it unless there's some really overwhelming reason to do it. You can say, I'll get your point next time if it's something you feel like can be talked about another time. In other words, if it doesn't have to be in this story. Just remember that it's your story, and that they're going to push you and push you and push you as far as they think they can. And part of the value of standing up to them is that they'll understand that they can't, in a polite way, in a professional way, right? I mean, I'm not saying be hostile, and I would never be hostile with the Trump people either, by the way. But stand your ground where you think that they're full of shit. And you're okay. Don't worry, they'll come back.
Hi, I'm Mariana Alfaro with the Washington Post. And kind of tying back to what you just answered over here about the trust and all this stuff that Trump said about the press. But are there any steps you've taken or changes you've made over the last few years to kind of regain the public's trust in the New York Times and the things you write, both from left and right, given all this energy that came from the Trump administration? Yeah,
it's a good question. We have this debate a lot of the times. I think one thing is that A.G. Sulzberger wrote that piece. We have done more, I think, to try to be more transparent about how we do our job. I think the Post does too. But we have a page 2 feature now called Times Insider, which will usually be about some story and how it came together, so that people can understand that a little bit better. We have more, we get out there on TV and podcasts more, try to, describe what we're working on and how we work better. We do talks. I mean, obviously not just a journalist, fellow journalists, but I think we need to do more, though. I think we need to do more to explain ourselves to the public. What I've found is that people think the media is this big impersonal monster as opposed to individual people like us, right? And we're all human. We make mistakes. We get things wrong. But we want to do the right thing. We want to get the story as best we can. If we can convince them of that, we'll be in better shape. And the reason I know that is because I would get these emails from people. Someone was just really very hostile, and you're a this, and you're a that, and blah, blah, blah. And except for the ones that are truly scatological and racist and anti-Semitic, I try to respond, even if they're irredeemably hostile, and say, I understand what you're saying. I actually made the point you are discussing in the 5th paragraph, or the reason I didn't make it is because of Y, or we didn't write that in this story, but we did do another story. Maybe you missed it a few days ago, addressed your concern here. If you just try to respond to them in a polite and respectful way, 2/3 of the time I found they got back and said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so nasty. I just frustrated or whatever, but thank you for replying. Or I don't agree with you, but thank you. I do appreciate your getting back to me. They don't think of us as human beings. They think of us as a big monolithic institution. And the more we make them understand that we are individual reporters who are doing our best to try to get the story right and not some big monolithic institution, don't judge us by our worst moments, but by our best, then we have a better chance. But we have not done that systematically nearly enough.
I
I wanted to ask about, you said that you wanted to stay through this story to the end. I was wondering if that story ends with Trump or if he's left an indelible mark on the Republican Party. You see a lot of the same techniques used by the DeSantis administration in Florida, a lot of statewide offices in places like Texas. Do you think this ends with Trump?
No, but when I said I was going to stay at the end, I didn't mean I was going to stay until like the Republican Party is completely changed. That's not going to happen soon. I think you're right. Trump has had a lasting and will have a lasting effect. And the way that changes is the repudiation of him, which there doesn't seem to be. Right? You would have thought after January 6th, they might have said, okay, we need to rethink our brand. They did that in 1976 after Watergate, and they took a real drubbing in 1974 midterm election. They tried to change their brand. Reagan was their way of sort of, starting over again, in effect. Democrats did the same thing after McGovern, and they wanted to change their brand. Clinton was the ultimate manifestation of that. Republicans are probably far away at this point from changing their brand, whether Trump wins next year or not. I think that the energy in the party is still with Trump and Trumpism right now. And there is very little room, it looks like, for a non-Trump-ish candidate. Now, that may change. We'll see. If Trump gets, I still think that I'm not predicting this, but I think that if there's a second indictment or a third indictment or a fourth indictment, you never know if that ultimately weighs him down and people just say, okay, enough of that. Now, if they go to DeSantis, that still means they're picking Trumpism of some sort. But maybe DeSantis doesn't pull it out either. Maybe somebody like a Chris Christie or a Mike Pence or somebody who is Trump-ish, but not as Trumpy, right, and begins to move the party away from Trump is a unique individual. Trying to be like Trump, I think, has been hard for other Republicans because very few people can pull it off the way he does. Right? He has a unique connection to his audience that DeSantis, for instance, does not. I mean, he just has a visceral connection and a way of inspiring them that other Republicans can't fake. I would go to these rallies and they'd get up there, the introducers, and they would give all the Trumpian lines and everything. Like the crowd was flat. They weren't buying it. It was only when Trump got up did they really get excited. So I'm not sure how this will play out. When I say I'm going to stay there to the end of the story, I mean to Trump. Okay, I'm not committing beyond that. If Trump is done after next year, then fine, maybe I'll think about moving on. If he's going to be president again, I feel obligated to. And don't hold me to this. Maybe I'll change my mind. But I feel the
You're
moment.
getting yourself in trouble.
I know. I feel some obligation to come back and stay at the White House as long as he's there, just because I think the story is important and it's I don't want to leave until that's finished.
Well, I think we could go on and on for here.
Well, thank you guys. I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys as you make your way through this great profession, and I'm really happy that you're giving it a try because we need fresh blood, and we need all of you to tell us how to fix what we've screwed up.
Great. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you.